Peace, everyone. It's your girl, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in for another story time with more of my. I am into another read called Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to Present by Harriet A. Washington. And I'm still in the intro, so this is part 2 of the intro. The intro was kind of lengthy. We ended on page 11 where it says finding the truth in plain sight. So I'm just going to hop back into it. It is medical researchers themselves who have documented the proof of this long, unhappy history of African Americans as research subjects. Even so, this history has been a challenge to document because it has been hidden in plain sight, widely scattered, distorted, and rendered all but unrecognizable as abused by heavy editorializing. As I recall the years I have spent ferreting out these experiments bit by bit, examining their patterns and probing the mindsets that they revealed, I am put in mind of the legal discovery process. A favorite ploy is to provide the opposing side with all the information it seeks, buried in towering mountains of unrelated or tangent. This book is tripping me up. I have got to get a dictionary. I think I was bringing one. I went back home to North Carolina to visit, and I got some stuff out the attic, and I saw a mini dictionary, and I think I accidentally left it. Let me slow down. Tangen, Tially. We know Shali, Tially, Shali. Tangentially related documents. Similarly, I have perused dusty antebellum medical journals, the Surgeon General's Index, its successor, the Medline database, physicians' memoirs and literary efforts, slave narratives, and painfully picked my way through foreign publications in alien tongues that are sometimes more forthcoming than domestic publications about the history of our medical treatment of minority groups. Mining the bright but thin lodes within these resources, I gradually amassed a cache of evidence. As previously hidden experimental exploits come to light, some have challenged the characterization of such research as secret, noting that the reports were published in medical and scientific journals that could be read by anyone. But these critics would do well to weigh Marcel Pagnol's definition of secrecy. A secret is not something unrevealed, but told privately in a whisper. Until the past few decades, descriptions in medical publications of experimentation with African Americans was shielded from the eyes of the uninitiated. Generalized professional journals such as the Journal of American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine are not available in bookstores or on newsstands. Specialized medical journals are even less accessible, and access was even more restricted in past decades. The medical libraries that house these journals have historically been closed to the public, and most remain so. Indeed, I have been challenged while entering such libraries while a student or instructor at various northern universities. Moreover, physical access to such journals would constitute only the first hurdle. The medical jargon in which such research papers are couched is often impenetrable even to well-educated non-medical people. But some of the people central to medical research have been more generous with their knowledge. Scores of researchers, physicians, and research subjects have shared their time and expertise and added depth to my understanding of the cultural divergence that has fed this history. Often they told me more than they realized. For example, a duality has persisted as I've had learned from them more than the facts of scientifically questionable and ethically troubled medical research. Whether we were discussing the etiology of tuberculosis, gynecological surgery, or the implication of census health statistics, these sources have conveyed to me Rorschach-like divergent medical worldviews. The overarching presence of two Americas, one healthy and white and the other filled with sick, disaffected people of color, has haunted our discussions. Scientists who abuse, exploit, lie to research subjects get more than their share of ink, but I have spent enough time among physician scientists to believe that most American researchers, white and black, are idealistic and skilled. However, when it comes to abuse of African Americans, a different set of ethical standards has long prevailed, and abusive researchers have historically been closer to the norm than we would like to think. Conventional wisdom pins experimental abuse on the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, a scientific outcast of dubious pedigree who harbors blatant social and mental maladjustment. But historically, most perpetrators of ethically troubling experiments utilizing African Americans have been overachieving adepts with sterling reputations, impressive credentials, and social skills sufficient to secure positions of great responsibility. The stereotype of the abusive researcher as a coolie, amoral renegade is a stock figure borrowed by journalism from science fiction. Like all stereotypes, it is one-dimensional and therefore false. Professionally and socially, these rogue stars have much more in common with the top strata of other successful American researchers than they do with mythical madmen. In fact, researchers who exploit African Americans were the norm for much of our nation's history, when black patients were commonly regarded as fit subjects for nonsensical, non-therapeutic research. This book explores the many reasons that blacks are so vulnerable, but ultimately it is because American medical researchers remain a racially homogeneous group, and I show how the racial homogeneity of American medical researchers lies at the very heart of the problem. The curious world of medical research. Ironically, my interest in medical research using African Americans is a direct outgrowth of my long-standing fascination with the more noble history of medicine. In fact, when asked to describe my work, I usually explain that I am a medical voyeur. I am an admirer of medicine, and when not working alongside physicians or hospitals, I have spent decades profiling, describing, and analyzing medical advances and the remarkable people who make them. In my many magazine and newspaper articles and in books that celebrate modern medical innovation, I've tried to convey the achievement, mission, and wonder of healers. My greatest challenge has usually been to avoid descending into frank hagiography. This admiration began at age 8 when Albert Schweitzer, Out of My Life in Thought, became my favorite book, but it crystallized while I was an undergraduate at the University of Rochester. My favorite floor of the undergraduate library housed physicians' memoirs and medical swashbuckle genre that included such titles as My Patients Were Zulus and Burma Doctor. These heroic reminiscences of lands populated by African and Asians mingled adventure with medical proselytizing and constituted a guilty pleasure for me as I pored over them when I should have been reading the assigned Chaucer or genetics. These readings also constituted a guilty pleasure because, although I originally read them as accounts of selfless physicians who cared for people of color, I soon realized these accounts reeked of xenophobia. Most were deeply disdainful of the natives on whom physicians bestowed the blessings of Western medicine and Western civilization. Because these exploits were distant in time as well as geography, I was less critical than I should have been when they sneered at the ignorant customs of superstitious natives. It all happened so long ago, I thought. Surely those colonial attitudes are dead now. I even made excuses for doctors whose disdainful observations were sprinkled with ethnic slurs, or when they congratulated themselves for conducting dramatic, not always benign experiments upon the unwitting. I excused them on the basis that all this had taken place. I excused them on the basis that all this had taken place in the unenlightened past. How could we judge them for abuses conducted under the aegis of yesterday's morals? As the years passed, this became a progressively unsatisfying rationalization, and I eventually abandoned my medical adventures. Some years later, I opened a drawer and lost the remains of my innocence. I was running a modest poison control center in a teaching hospital in upstate New York, and we poured this book is tripping me up. Toxicologic relations, and we poured toxicologic relations had expanded into a space that had been reluctantly yielded us by radiology or real medical department. When I opened a recalcitrant drawer of a file cabinet that had been left behind, a few forgotten medical folders from the 1970s littered its bottom. One contained the file of an older gentleman in imminent kidney failure and focused upon documenting the reams of tests and assessments entailed in finding him a matching kidney for transplant. The social history stressed his loving family and determination to live. Another file also described the plight of an older man in kidney failure, but it looked different, thinner. The first page I read documented his odyssey into sickness as his kidneys failed. It noted, among other things, that he was retired, insured, and Negro. Nearly every page recorded his race, and someone had underlined it on his official profile just above the line that indicated that the medical staff's plans for him were not to secure a transplant, but to help him to prepare for his imminent demise. It was signed by a kind, erudite physician I knew and admired and who had actively encouraged my interest in medicine. I could not reconcile the signature with the man I knew, a sensitive scholar and devout Christian. Probably, I thought, I was jumping to conclusion, and the patient's race had nothing to do with this failure to be considered for a life-saving organ. When I haltingly voiced my fears to an African-American acquaintance who has worked as a ward clerk in the nephrology unit, she looked at me as if I were not too bright and minced no words. Girl, black people don't get organs, they give organs. During our ensuing debate, she pointed out to me that the race bias in the hospital where we worked should have resolved any doubts. In the early 1980s, most of its black employees worked in housekeeping and clerical support. Blacks were noticeably scarce among the administrative and medical staffs. Why, she asked, was I naive enough to believe racial bias stopped at the staffing roster? This was hardly proof, but my discomfort grew as she categorized instance after instance of overt bias and finally declared, I would never have a procedure done here. I've seen too much. To them, if you're black and poor, you're nothing but a guinea pig. I realized that my discomfort with her words went beyond the truth or falsity of her allegations. The mere fact that she believed them was unsettling. Because she had worked in a hospital setting, was presumably better informed than most, yet she did not trust the medical system and seemed less likely to turn to it when ill. The perception of evil in such cases, I realized, can prove as damaging as malfeasance itself. I finally glimpsed that understanding the true extent of unethical medical research with African Americans was more than idle curiosity or an academic exercise. It was key to removing barriers between African Americans and the bounty of the American healthcare system. In the hospital's medical library, I discovered a new genre of physician confessional literature, one that described black patients not in Africa but here in the United States. Unlike the African book-length exploits, these often consisted of a revealing passage or two in an autobiography, a few pages in a memoir, or a horary article in a 19th century medical journal. I recognize in these Western accounts of black American patients the very same stereotypes belabored in African accounts. References in American physicians' memoirs and journal articles were studied with telling vignettes and observations of black patients, of their black patients. The stories physicians told mixed stereotyped comedy with exasperation as they dismissed blacks as disease-ridden, unintelligent, fearful, distrustful, and above all, non-compliant patients. By non-compliant, doctors meant patients who could not be trusted to follow medical advice or even to act intelligently in their own best medical interests. I realized that such negative presumptions hamper physicians' ability to care for black patients or even to see them as worthy of the same excellent care rendered to others. For their part, the black patients I met and interviewed share their own medical lore, which warned against trusting Western medical practices and physicians, a matrix they characterize as racist, rapacious, 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 and eager to exploit black bodies for medical gain at the cost of health. Thus, the disparate narratives African Americans and physicians tell unveil a state of undeclared war or, at best, an uneasy truce between physicians and their black patients. But I knew that analyzing the history of African Americans as research subjects would necessitate more than a familiarity with history and contemporary medical literature. A sound understanding of basic medical sciences and medical cultures, regulations, protocols, research design, and procedures would also be necessary. This will require a research plan enabling me to ferret out studies in a wide variety of disciplines and subjects. Finally, I would have to speak to medical researchers, subjects, and patients about sensitive experiences. At that time, around 1980, data on racial health disparities was sparse and anecdotal, and in any event, I felt unqualified to take on such a daunting task. I had some grounding in the basic medical sciences, but having abandoned my pre-medical studies, my knowledge was incomplete. However, I occupied a good vantage point from which to observe and accrue an understanding of medical research culture. I had worked in hospitals for a decade, in positions ranging from ward clerk to laboratory technician to department manager, and in venues ranging from the animal laboratory to the cancer research laboratories to the psychiatric emergency department to the poison control center. The physicians for whom I worked openly discussed their work with me and were more forthcoming with me as a lowly clerk or technician than it would have been with a journalist. I eventually left the hospital to work as an inner-city medical social worker and sworn in settings where I constantly talked to African-American clients and their caregivers about their beliefs and behaviors concerning medical care and research. I then worked as a journalist, most notably as a news editor and science editor at a daily metropolitan newspaper for 7 years, including a brief stint at USA Today. After that, I worked as a medical journalist, a columnist, and contributing editor for several national magazines. My work was published by the New York Times Syndicate and appeared in popular publications as diverse as Health, USA Today, Essence, and Psychology Today. I was also published in academic publications such as the Harvard Public Health Review, Nature, and the American Journal of Public Health, and I edited the Harvard Journal of Minority Public Health, an especially valuable experience. A monthly medical column that I wrote for Emerge magazine gave me experience in framing the issues this book explores for a general audience and opened a conduit for numerous first-person testimonies as well. On a parcel track, I obtained a firm scientific background by completing a pre-medical course and medical school courses in immunology, toxicology, and neuroscience. As I took classes with medical and doctoral students and postdocs, they became my best sources for relating contemporary research that I had participated in. Often they confessed to being troubled by ethical concerns, and this validated my anxiety about some disquieting trends in the commercialization of medical care and in what I increasingly perceived as an erosion of informed consent to research. Academic institutions, including Stanford, Maryland, and the Medical University of Lubeck, invited me to share with their scholars what I was learning about the hidden history of experimentation with African Americans. At the same time, I embarked upon a Harvard Medical School fellowship in medical ethics. We addressed thorny issues in the philosophy and policy of medical research and engaged in a wealth of reading seminars with important experts. But it is my own assessments of these studies, informed by my medical ethics training, that form the basis of the ethical analysis in this work. They stand or fall on my own logic and historical knowledge. The scope and structure of medical apartheid. I was determined that medical apartheid not be a simplistic black hats, white hats story in which African Americans are passive victims and researchers are always villains. Instead, the book takes a frank but more nuanced look at the calculus of racism's effects on experimental practice. I've attempted to write a social history that chases the key role that various researchers have played in both promulgating and refuting racism in medicine. It is impossible and undesirable to incorporate every instance of racialized experimental abuse that I unearthed. This would have resulted in a long, dreary checklist of horrors and little useful insight. The bulk of questionable experimentation upon African Americans is not detailed here because much of it consists of aberrations in therapeutics that were ostensibly meant to cure. Attempts to heal that transgress against ethical rules by dramatically escalating dosages and techniques, or that involve non-material breaches of consent, are still wrong and risky, but they concern me less because they are sometimes products of honest error and because the intent is still to heal or help. This book focuses more heavily upon experiments with mammoth risk, little or no therapeutic content, or no possible benefit to the subject, and upon mere attempts at exploitation to perfect medications, procedures, and techniques. Therefore, this book is not a complete chronology of abusive racial research. Rather, it is thematically organized collection of historical and contemporary issues in medical research with African Americans, illustrated by important cases. I also broach a discussion of such previously ignored historical themes as the fact that fraud is often a traveling partner of racially abusive research. I also explored the history of using African Americans in experimentation intended to support unflattering racial stereotypes and beliefs. African Americans have been used, for example, to perfect the IQ test that would prove them inferior in intelligence, to divide the triponymal test that would prove them ridden with a distinctive strain of syphilis, and to perform this painful skin and visceral dissection that will prove that blackness or negritude is a permanent mark of biological inferiority that exists independent of skin color. Some other important medical issues have been excluded from this work because they spill outside the strictest thematic boundaries of African Americans in medical research. Despite the long and rich history of medical abuse in African and other third world countries, much of it is conducted by U.S. researchers. There is no chapter detailing such research in this book. In one sense, this is akin to discussing Jewish issues without discussing Israel, but the sweeping history of such research is far too extensive to address in a single chapter, especially because it is burdening rather than abating. Similarly, it is impossible to capture completely the important work of African American researchers in a single chapter, and I reluctantly defer to discussion of this neglected subject, both for space reasons and because Black researchers have tended to engage in therapeutic research rather than in troubled investigations that are the subject of this work. Medical Apartheid consists of 15 chapters organized into 3 parts. Part 1, A Troubling Tradition, takes a chronological approach to the role of African Americans in early American medicine. It stresses the experimental abuse and exploitation of African Americans from the first encounters in the New World through the post-Civil War era, and then up into the Tuskegee syphilis study, which began in 1932. Part 2, The Usual Subjects, covers the period from the early 20th century to the present day in a roughly chronological manner. However, it departs from strict chronology in favor of an analysis of specific types of vulnerable subjects, children, soldiers, and hospital patients, used in research conducted by institutions ranging from the federal government to private corporations. Part 3, Race, Technology, and Medicine, examines contemporary research issues, including genetic research, investigations into emerging diseases, and bioterrorism. In the epilogue, Medical Research for Blacks Today, I discuss how the worst abuses have been replaced by more subtle threats to the rights of the individual to choose whether and when to participate in medical research. Finally, the appendix directs readers to a wealth of guidelines and regulations to help them navigate clinical trials. Why research still matters. Why do centuries of mutual distrust over medical research matter today? What does the sad history of exploitive experimentation augur for Black health? What the French see in wine, Americans see in healthcare. Mused Robert J. Blendon, Ph.D., Professor of Health Policy and Political Analysis at the Harvard School of Public Health. Americans consider access to excellent health and even the most expensive means of maintaining it their birthright. Americans enjoy ever-burgeoning longevity, extravagant nutrition, and everyday access to superb medical care, including expensive high-technology interventions. From CAT scans on demand to new hips to keep us on the tennis courts and new hearts to keep us in the game, we demand the best care, including novel and experimental therapies. Our devotion to the very latest and expensive remedies for increasingly marginal medical gains has many Americans bumping up against the law of diminishing returns. At the same time, medical experts of every persuasion agree that African Americans share the most deplorable health profile in the nation, by far one that resembles that of third world countries. When Dr. Harold Friedman observed that the health status of Harlem men resembles that of Bangladesh more closely than that of their Manhattan neighbors, he did not exaggerate. Twice as many African American babies as babies of other ethnic groups die before their first birthday. 1.5 times as many African American adults as white adults die every year. Blacks have dramatically higher rates of nearly every cancer, of AIDS, of heart disease, of diabetes, of liver disease, of infectious diseases, and they even suffer from higher rates of accidental death, homicide, and mental illness. Before they die young in droves from eminently preventable diseases, African Americans also suffer far more devastating but equally preventable disease complications, such as blindness, confinement to wheelchairs, and limb loss. Studies continue to demonstrate that, far from sharing the bounty of American medical technology, African Americans are often bereft of high technology care, even for life-threatening conditions such as heart disease. The much bewailed racial health gap is not a gap, but a chasm wider and deeper than a mass grave. This gulf has riven our nation so dramatically that it appears as if we were considering the health profiles of people in two different countries, a medical apartheid. Researchers have proffered a cornucopia of theories for this medical divide, many of which focus upon putative biological dimorphisms, especially genetic differences. But in dissecting this shameful medical apartheid, an important cause is usually neglected: the history of ethically flawed medical experimentation with African Americans. Such research has played a pivotal role in the forging the fear of medicine that helps perpetrate our nation's racial health gulf. Historically, African Americans have been subjected to exploitive, abusive, involuntary experimentation at a rate far higher than other ethnic groups. Thus, although the heightened African American wariness of medical research and institutions reflects a situational hypervigilance, it is neither a baseless fear of harm nor a fear of imaginary harms. A paranoid label is often affixed to blacks who are wary of participating in medical research. However, not only is paranoid a misnomer, but but it is also symbolic of a dangerous misunderstanding. That is why I refer to African American fears of medical professionals and institutions as iatrophobia, coined from the Greek word iatros, healer, and phobia, fear. Black iatrophobia is the fear of medicine. Even those who investigate the role of medical ethics and medical policy are trying to dissect and analyze the much decried African American aversion to medical research without understanding the history that created that aversion. The historical cause of the racial health gap, has been only crudely and curiously examined and is usually reduced to knee-jerk responses to the Tuskegee syphilis study, as if this were the only instance of problematic medical experimentation. But scores of historical events connected with medical research have plagued Black Americans and affected their health-seeking behavior. This historical silence is a grave omission because trying to ameliorate African American health without understanding the pertinent history of medical care is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history, a hazardous and probably futile approach. Kill the messenger. In fact, some otherwise well-meaning people wish to censor any analysis of troubled research with African Americans, as I discovered firsthand to my great surprise. I was elated when a professor at a U.S. medical school summoned me to her office, explaining that she wanted to hear all about the book I was writing. Ensconced in a chair, I eagerly began to describe my work, only to be cut off before I completed the first sentence. Bolting upright in her chair, she vehemently informed me that the topic of this book was taboo. It's a terrible thing that you are doing. You are going to make African Americans afraid of medical research and physicians. You cannot write this book. As she glared at me, her face became contorted with anger, suffused with blood, and her breathing grew rapid. For a moment, I was stunned into silence, because nothing had prepared me for her reaction. After all, freedom of speech and academic freedom are sacred in this country. I was also a bit surprised that a white academic whose discussions and syllabus had evinced no interest or expertise in the matter should lecture me, an experienced African-American medical writer, about health communication with African Americans. She proceeded to inform me that there had been no medical research utilizing African Americans before the Tuskegee syphilis studies, certainly not in the antebellum past. So when I asked her how she knew that, she countered, "Can you prove that there was?" Yeah, the fuck? When I responded simply yes, she disgorged a clumsy inquisition, unleashing a barrage of questions that showed she knew nothing about the subject at hand. I responded that my work was well researched and that she had raised an interesting question. Was it indeed my work that would make African Americans wary of healthcare and medical research, or had the work of those whose abuses I proposed to chronicle already achieved this? That's the question. The answer was all too obvious. I knew from years as a medical social worker, a medical journalist, and researcher that Black Americans did not need me or anyone else to inculcate a fear of medicine. Medical history and practices had long since done so. Medical apartheid is my attempt to document at long last and as fully as possible how and why this happened. Well, all right. We appreciate that. Yeah. Talking about nothing happened before Tuskegee. Are you out your mind? So that's the end of the intro. And it looks like there's a pretty lengthy chapter 1. So I'll be likely doing that in doses. Thank y'all for tuning in. I'll tune in again soon. And if you are not already, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Morgan Myers, or you can type in Storytime with Morama, which is my initials for Morgan Renee Myers, Moremy. Excuse me, and you'll find these readings and past readings of other books. So thank y'all for tuning in. I'll tune in with you again soon. Peace.